NURB surfaces require no UV mapping, as by default they are unwrapped to a square shape in UV space. You can therefore place textures relatively easily. Utilizing the interactive placement, you can intuitively place your texture in the viewport. NURB surfaces, however, can cause texture warping. A quick fix to this is the Fix Texture Warp function in the Shape node. In some cases this will not work, and you'll have to rebuild your surface or duplicate its surface curve and use them to create a new surface. This will distribute the texture uniformly. Polygons require UV maps to texture. Images can then be wrapped around the geometry based on the UV coordinates. UV texturing requires a good UV layout. The area and shape of a polygon in UV space should be as near as possible to the area and shape of a polygon in 3D space. Texture stretching and warping occurs when this is not the case. In certain cases, when texturing polygons and NURBs, texture warping will be unavoidable. One workaround for this is to project textures onto your geometry. Projections override UVs by converting your images to 3D textures and projecting them onto your geometry in 3D space. Projections are also good for multiple pieces of geometry. The UV snapshot is used as a guide for texturing. Once you've laid out your UVs, a UV snapshot can be created and opened up in Photoshop. Without this guide, we would have to place our textures by trial and error. Adobe Photoshop is the industry choice for image manipulation. We can open, combine, manipulate and augment images in order to create a texture to apply in Maya. Generally speaking, you should make your textures square, as UV space by default is square. Your texture resolution should also be to the power of 2, e.g. 256, 512, 1024, 2048 or even 4096. Without going into too much detail, everything in computing comes down to binary, a numeric system that stores data using two symbols, a 1 or a 0. Therefore, any value to the power of 2 is quicker to compute than a value that isn't. Choosing your texture resolution often isn't given enough thought. Biggest isn't always best. Larger textures take more time to render, so some thought is needed. What resolution am I rendering at? In terms of UV space, and therefore texture, how much of my texture is occupying the screen? If I'm rendering at 1024 by 1024 pixels, my geometry is economically UV mapped, and my object covers a quarter of the screen, I can safely assume a 512 by 512 texture would be appropriate. In general, a 24-bit image with 8 bits per channel will be fine for an RGB texture intended just as color. If, however, I wanted to introduce some transparency as well, an RGBA texture, 32-bit with 8 bits per channel, would be more appropriate. Painting all your textures by hand will take a long time and no small amount of skill. Photographs and existing images are an excellent starting point. Even prepared textures can be found or bought on the internet. Provided there's no copyright, it's not cheating, honestly. Often you'll find hours trying to find just the right photo to make a texture. If you don't want to have to pay for your textures, there are a few good free photo sites. Google Images, CG Textures, Image After, sxc.hu or flickr.com. Taking photos with a digital camera is your best bet though. You can choose your own camera angle, subject matter and resolution. More often than not, you just won't be able to find that perfect image to make the texture you want. The answer is clever use of Photoshop to clean up and isolate certain sections of your images. Combining different elements of photographs to create a composite image for use as a texture is your goal. Whenever possible, look for a tool in Photoshop that will quickly achieve the result you're looking for. Even if it's only used as a starting point for something which you tweak further by hand, this will save you a lot of time. An example of this might be selecting a certain portion of your image. You don't want to go around selecting it, zoomed in with the polygonal lasso tool. This kind of process would take a long time. A better way would be to use something like the color range to sample the color you want to select. Working in a way that doesn't destroy your image is desirable. A non-linear workflow with regular layers, layer masks, quick masks and adjustment layers allows you to remain flexible and backtrack at any point. Once you've created a texture for color, in certain cases you will need a bump and specular map. A rough workflow might be to convert your color map to black and white, remove unwanted details and then use this as a bump map. This bump map could then be manipulated with levels to give you a suitable specular map. Additional augmentation may be needed by hand. When saving your work in progress, The native PSD format is lossless and saves all your layers. Textures for use in Maya should be saved as TIFFs or targas, with no compression and no layers. In the Hypershade we can create procedural textures, we can combine and manipulate images, and we can even circumvent UVs altogether. In Photoshop, provided we have good UVs, we can fully prepare images and map them directly to attributes in Maya. Hypershade workflow can be faster to tweak and is essential for more complex shaders, but can be harder to learn. Photoshop can be easier to implement at first, but requires jumping between software packages to tweak. In this tutorial, we're going to follow the whole process of creating textures from photos and texturing an object in Maya. We're going to look at how we can create color textures, textures for bump information, and also textures for specular information. I'm going to start off by creating a square texture from a brick wall photograph, correcting the perspective distortion and also making sure the resolution is correct. I'm going to start off in Photoshop and go File, Open, and inside this tutorial's project we should find some source images in our source images folder, brick wall, graffiti and pavement. I'm just going to open up brick wall. This photo, as you can see here, is a photograph of a brick wall. If we have a look under image size, we can see it's quite large, 2500 pixels by 1900 pixels. And if we go to view actual pixels, you can see just how high resolution that actually is. For now though, I'm going to leave it at view fit on screen just so we can see all of it. And we can see that this picture here has a little bit of distortion from perspective and also camera angle, and these lines of mortar and bricks aren't entirely straight. And in order to create a good texture, we need to make sure we've got a perfectly square texture with no distortion, nice straight horizontal and vertical lines. So what we're going to do is use the crop tool here, which will allow us to designate a section of our image which we can crop and create a new image size. What I'm going to do is hold down Shift and draw a square here, and I'm going to grab a section roughly from this part of my image here. And in order to fix the distortion, we can tick perspective at the top here and then reposition these points of our crop selection. All we need to do is work out a square according to perspective by following the lines of the mortar and the bricks, so that when we hit return, Photoshop will crop the image and then fix the distortion. In order to do this correctly, and in order to help us when we come to tiling our image, we need to choose sensible locations for these crop points. So what I'm going to do is choose corners of bricks here. So if I use Ctrl+ to zoom in and spacebar while dragging on the image here to move it, we can see that I'm positioning this particular point at the corner of this brick, halfway in between the horizontal and vertical mortar sections there. Then with Ctrl-, if I zoom out, I need to follow this mortar line and reposition this point as well in order to follow this line here. So if I use Ctrl+ to zoom in and spacebar while clicking on the canvas, we can make sure that this point as well is positioned correctly. And you can see that I've made sure I start and end horizontally on the same or the equivalent section of brick here. So when we tile this texture, we should hopefully get no seam at all. We need to do the same with these points at the bottom here. So we need to make an imaginary line down here following this particular brick pattern, and then move this point to the correct place as well. And you can see we've got a repeating pattern vertically as well. We've got these large bricks, then these small bricks, and then these offset large bricks, then the small bricks again, and then this large brick in the same position as this one here. So our repeat is of 4 bricks here. So if we make sure that we finish just above the corner of one of these large bricks, we should crop it in the correct place. And again, I'm going to use Control minus and Control plus and space bar in order to position these. So if we move this point, we can follow this line of mortar here and position it about here. And then when we're happy, I'm just going to go View, Fit on Screen, and then hit Return to crop our image to a square texture. Next, I'm going to use the filter offset in order to fix the seams at the edges of my image and therefore create a tileable texture. If I go View, Fit on Screen, we can see our entire texture there. And I'm going to go Filter, Other, Offset. And this filter actually offsets all the pixels horizontally and vertically by this amount here. This means that we can then see the seams, or the pixels that would have been on the edges horizontally and vertically as well. You can see them here. This is the vertical seam, and here this is the horizontal seam. So I'm just going to hit OK for now. What I'm going to do is use the healing brush tool in order to remove this seam. The healing brush tool allows us to sample some pixels in our image by holding down Alt and clicking on the canvas. We get this little crosshairs here. Once we've done that, we can click or stamp over our seam in order to copy those pixels, and the healing brush will analyze the surrounding pixels and try and blend in our stamp with the existing image. So if I do Control plus to zoom in a little bit, and then spacebar to move upwards, we can have a look and see how that works. So I've made sure my brush size is roughly the same size as this mortar here. And then what I'm going to do is hold down Alt, click on the mortar, release Alt, and then I can draw across the seam here to copy this particular section over to here. So I'll take another sample and copy across the seam. And you can see there's a slight blending in after we finished as well. And we can do the same for the bricks here as well. We can sample by holding Alt, clicking on a section of the image, and then drawing down across the seam. And the same up here as well. Sample a brick, copy that across here. The only thing that we need to remember when we're doing this is where we sample is quite important. So if I was doing a vertical seam here, I would sample at the top of this brick here and then draw down from the top here. If I was to sample here and draw upwards, we would see that I put in some of the mortar pattern here. So just be aware that it's important where you sample as to what you will actually paint. If you do a particular clone stamp that doesn't work too well, you can always hit Ctrl Z to undo. But it's really just a case of going across the entire seam and just removing it with the spot healing brush. I've just sped this section of the tutorial up, as really there's no new concepts introduced here. It's just the same use of the same tool over and over again. And really the key to this is just sampling the correct portion of your image and stamping that over the seam, being aware that you need to try and keep continuity from one side of the seam to the other. Otherwise, even though you won't have the sharp seam edge, it still might be obvious to the human eye that there's something strange going on there. In some particular cases, the healing brush isn't the best option, and this is because, as mentioned before, when we clone a section and stamp it, then Photoshop will analyze the surrounding pixels and try and blend our stamp into that. So in this case here, if I select this dark brick and try and paint it across here, we can see that it's been blended to white slightly. In this case, it might be better to use the clone stamp here, which has no healing effects after we've stamped. So I can take a section here and stamp it over here. And get a much more satisfying result. And then I might want to go back afterwards to using my healing brush tool again. And again, in this section, it's just repetitive use of the spot healing tool in order to go over the seam for the bricks and the mortar. Once you've finished the horizontal seam, if we go back to view actual pixels, or in fact view fit on screen, we can see that the actual seam position now has been disguised. We no longer know where that is, although we might be able to guess it. Somewhere along here. Next we need to fix the vertical seam along here, and we can do that exactly the same. Zoom in with Control plus, using space just to move our image across, and again using the healing brush tool, just sampling a horizontal section of mortar, say here, holding down Alt, clicking on the image, and then holding down Shift. I'm just going to draw that all the way across my seam here, and by holding down Shift I can constrain my mouse movement horizontally so I don't accidentally go up and down. Then it's just a case of picking a particularly good section of horizontal mortar here, holding down Alt, clicking on the image, and then holding down Shift, just drawing across my seam here. And we can go along our entire image, just removing that seam. And then once again, when we've done that, just go view fit on screen, just to view the finished result. Next we're going to save our image and do exactly the same thing to a different photograph. Last thing to do before saving this texture is just to check it's the correct size, and we can do that under image size. We can see due to our cropping there we've got a width of 1340 and a height of 1240, even though we tried to keep it square to begin with. So I'm just going to change that, making sure constraint proportions is turned off. I'm going to change it to 1024 by 1024. It's always best to have a square texture, because when we import a texture into Maya, it will be stretched to fit UV space anyway, which is square. And we keep it to the power of 2, because in terms of binary calculations, it's slightly quicker and there's no remainder if something's to the power of 2. So we're going to hit OK. And then I'm going to save my image, File, Save As. I'm going to save it inside our source images folder. And we're going to make sure we save it, rather than a JPEG, we're going to save it as a TIFF. This is because JPEGs can lose quality each time you save them, so it's always best to work as TIFFs. And they're also uncompressed. And we're going to call this brick wall color.tiff, because this is going to be the texture we use for the color. Just going to hit save, and under the TIFF options I'm going to make sure we've got no compression. Just hit OK. With that done, we can close our image and then go File, Open, and open up another photograph, in this case pavement, which, as you can see, like before, is a photograph of some paving slabs, and there's some distortion caused by the camera. And we're going to fix this and also make our texture tileable by using the Offset and Clone Stamp tool. So make sure you've got your crop tool selected. Holding down Shift, just draw a square box to roughly this size. And I'm going to make sure that my square section I take is a 3x3 section of slabs here, which is going to make my life a bit easier, so we can make sure our seams are the grout in between the slabs. And using Control plus and the spacebar, I'm going to go around and just position the corners of my crop selection on the corners of each paving slab. And then once I'm happy with my positioning, I can go View, fit on screen, and then return just to crop my selection there. If we go to image size, we can see that it's not quite square there, so we can change that 1024 by 1024 and hit OK. And there you can see our square section that we've created. And if we go to filter, other offset, we can offset our image in order to fix the seams. You can see that we've already done quite a good job here. The seam is actually across here and here, and it's quite hard to see it at the moment, but we should probably fix it anyway. I'm going to hit OK. And then this time I'm going to use, rather than the spot healing brush, I'm going to use the clone stamp tool. And this is because we've got quite thin defined lines here, and I don't want any healing after I've stamped, as I'm going to lose some of the definition in my lines here. So what I'm going to do is make sure my brush size is roughly the same size as this grouting here. Hold down Alt and click on the image here to sample it, and then holding down Shift, which will constrain my mouse movement vertically, I'm going to draw a line down the seam here. I'm going to do the same horizontally as well. I'm going to sample from my image here, and holding down Shift, I'm going to draw my clone stamp all the way across my seam here. And again, we can sample from another area if we want. And just clean up our seam. And if we zoom in with Ctrl+, we can see that we no longer have that sharp edge across the middle there. View fit on screen again. What I'm going to do just before finishing up is just offset our image back again. Because we've got a defined 3x3 section here, it makes sense to keep our texture like that. So with a bit of fiddling around, we can actually get it in the correct place. Probably about 505. Whoops, don't hit return though until you've positioned both of them. Otherwise they'll continue to be offset. And then once you're happy, you can just hit OK. And this is our finished repeating texture here, which we're going to save. So File, Save As. Again, we're going to save it as a TIFF file format. And I'm going to call this Pavement Color. And then just hit Save. And OK. Next, we're going to use similar techniques to just remove some of the unique patterns in the pavement in order to make it better for tiling. If you look at these kind of scratch or paint marks on the pavement here, you can see that their individuality would mean that when we tile this texture, the human eye would fairly quickly pick up on the fact that this pattern is repeated over and over again, whereas a repeated cross-section of pavement slabs is okay because that's what you'd expect. So what we're going to do is use the healing brush tool again on quite a large brush size, just using the square brackets to go up. And I'm going to sample from our clean pavement slab here, holding down Alt and grabbing it in the middle, and just painting over some of these sections here in order to remove them. And provided we sample in a clean area and don't go too close to the borders here, we should be able to remove most of the issues here. If we don't get it quite right and we put some of this grouting by accident in, we can just make our brush size slightly smaller and just heal over the top of that. And now it's just a case of sampling the correct area and painting over the top of all these marks until we've got a fairly neutral texture. And there you can see our finished cleaned up texture. So what I'm going to do is just save that, File, Save As, and we can save it back over the top of our pavement colour. We don't necessarily need to keep our original, or you can give it a different name if you want to keep it. And just hit OK, and OK again. Next we're going to go into Maya, create some simple geometry and texture them using the textures we created. I'm going to start off by making sure our project's set. File, Project Set. As long as our project is set to the correct place, all of our textures should be in the correct place as well. Next I'm going to create some simple geometry to assign our textures to. In this case it's going to be some polygonal planes, so create polygon primitives plane. Just going to hit F to frame that, and 5 to show it in shaded. Then in the channel box I'm going to rename this. This is going to be my brick wall. And also in the inputs here I'm just going to turn down the subdivision's width and height just to 1. All we're going to be doing is applying a texture to it, so that's all we need, 1 polygon. And I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees to give me my wall. I'm going to do that by going to pivot point mode with Insert, then holding down V, point snap, and snapping it in the Z axis to this edge on my polygon. Then hitting Insert again to go out of pivot point mode. And then I'm going to hold down X with grid snap. I'm going to snap it to the origin here, 0, 0, 0. That means I can then rotate it 90 degrees in the X. Just finish that off in the channel box here to get it exact. And that gives me my nicely positioned brick wall. All that remains for me to do is just scale it up. I'm going to scale it up to 10 in the scale X, Y and Z, and actually 20 in the scale X here. This gives me an aspect ratio of 2 to 1. So what we can do is repeat our texture twice in this direction here in order to see our tiling work. Next I'm going to create some geometry for the floor by going Ctrl D to duplicate my brick wall, then E to go to my rotate tool, and I'm going to rotate that 90 degrees, which turns out to be 180 here because it's already rotated 90 degrees in the X, and that gives me my floor. Let's call that pavement. Just going to turn off my grid, show grid. I'm going to assign 2 new materials, one to each of these. Let's begin with our wall, select that, right click, assign new material, Lambert. I'm going to call this brick wall material. And then to the color attribute, I'm going to assign our color texture we created. So I'm going to click on the flag here, select File from our Create Render Node pop-up window to map a 2D file node to the color attribute. In the attribute editor I can navigate to the image that I want to map to this by clicking on the folder next to image name. And inside our current project source images we should have all our textures we created. In this case I'm going to select brick wall color and hit open. We can immediately see our brick wall texture here in our swatch, and if I go to hardware texturing under shading we can see that texture appears on my wall there. Currently we can see that my brick wall is stretched over across the x-axis here, when really we should have 2 instances of this, and we can change that in the place 2D texture here. If we scroll down a little bit we can see the repeat U and the repeat V here. Because our texture is tileable, what we can do is change the repeat U value to 2 to give us 2 instances of our texture, and there we have our brick wall with the correct proportions on the bricks there, repeated twice. So you can see we've got 1 texture here and one here, and we can't actually see the seam at all. What we're going to do now is the floor, so I'm going to select that, right click, assign new material, and again it's going to be a Lambert, and I'm going to call this pavement material. And again I'm going to map our texture to the color attribute there, so click on the flag, select a 2D file node from our create render node pop-up window. Just going to change our tabs from the place 2D texture node to the file, and then clicking on the folder here I can navigate to our source images and select pavement color and hit open. We can see that our pavement texture is now applied to our plane but stretched all the way across here rather than repeated twice. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. In the place 2D texture node I'm going to select that. Under repeat U and repeat V I'm going to change the repeat U to 2 to therefore have 2 instances of my texture on the floor there. If we want to see this rendered, we can go Panels, Save Layouts, or Panels Layouts to Paint Side by Side, and change one to our Render View, Panels, Render View. Just zoom in a little bit to our wall. Let's check our render settings first. I'm going to put them on preview quality to begin with, and I'm going to keep my image size as it is, 640 by 480, and then just hit render. And there we can see our textured wall. I'm also going to create a light, create lights, directional light. And I'm just going to rotate this slightly in order to see our texture a bit brighter. If we go lighting, use all lights, we can see the effect of our light there, and then just hit render again. So it's probably a good idea just to set up a camera to begin with, so we'll always be rendering from the same view. So I'm going to go create cameras, camera, and then panels, perspective, camera 1, and just position this camera to roughly about here. View, camera settings, resolution gate. And we can always check our textures from this angle now, making sure we render camera 1. So with our camera set up, we can lock its translates, rotates and scales so we don't accidentally move it. I'm going to select all of those. Right mouse button, lock selected in the channel box. And then I'm just going to increase my render settings a little bit by changing my quality up to production quality, because we've only got 2 polygons and 2 textures. We don't necessarily need to turn down our render settings to begin with, and then hit render again. We can see the anti-aliasing is slightly sharper. And the last thing I want to do is just turn off the filters on these textures. If we select our wall, Control A, and go to the brick wall material and navigate to the file texture under color here, we can see that it's got something called filter type here, quadratic. Now if I just save this image here and change this filter type to off, and then render again, and just hit 1 to 1, and just scroll between the two, you can see the slight difference there on the wall between the render with the filter type quadratic and the render with it off. And this slight blurring effect is caused by the filter, and if we've got a particularly high res texture that we know is good quality, then we don't necessarily need any kind of filtering on it, and we might get good results without the filter. So it's a good idea to be aware of this. We can do this as well on the floor here. We're going to select the pavement material, in the attribute editor navigate to our file here, turn the filter type from quadratic to off, and just render again. Next, we're going to create surface detail on our geometry by creating bump maps from the color textures we already created. I'm going to start off in Photoshop by opening up my brick wall color file from my source images. And we're going to turn this into an image that we can use as a bump map. A bump map is a black and white image where the luminance value of each pixel, or the brightness, is the height of that particular pixel on our surface. So we need to make this image into a black and white image, and we're going to try and make it so that white will represent objects that we want pushed out from our surface, and black will represent points that we want pulled into our surface. So it makes sense to make our bricks slightly lighter than our grouts. And in conjunction with the bump 2D node in Maya, that would give our geometry the illusion of surface detail. So we can make an object or an image black and white in a number of ways. A good one to use is image adjustments black and white. This turns our image black and white, but also gives us some control over what is black and what is white based on each channel in the pixel, i.e. red, yellow and green. And by adjusting these sliders, we can manipulate the contrast of our image, and also we can remove some of the variations in luminance as well. What we're aiming for is to try and eliminate any variations that are caused by shadows and highlights or by tonal variations. We've also got another filter we can use for this as well, which is the filter Other High Pass. And this allows us to remove detail in our image based on the size of the detail in pixels here. So a high setting here means that we don't remove much detail, but as we go down you can see we're only left with the large details such as the grouting and the bricks here. So perhaps something like this would be quite useful. Then all we'd have to do is just change the levels a little bit, image adjustment levels, just to put a bit more contrast back into our image. You can see that all the pixel values in our histogram are here in the middle, and we need to move the black point up a little bit and the white point down a little bit, and keep our grey point in the middle there, just to see a bit more contrast in our bump map. And then finally, we need to invert our image here, as we want our bricks to stick out and our grout to go in, and you can see that the grout's actually lighter here, so we're going to go image adjustments invert. When we're happy with that, we can save our image. Note that although it's black and white information, our image is actually still RGB color rather than grayscale. And we're going to go File, Save As, and call this brick wall bump. And hit OK. I'm going to do the same with our pavement, so File, Open up our pavement color. And make it black and white again with our image adjustments black and white. Again, we can play around with some of these sliders if we want to try and remove some of the dirt or the details. This red one in particular here, I can remove some of the dirt. And then hit OK. And then filter Other High Pass again, in order to try and remove as much detail as possible apart from the areas that we want bumped. So I'm just going to adjust the levels again. Perhaps there's something like this. And in this case we don't necessarily need to invert our image, as we can see that the cracks here are slightly darker, apart from the bits where there's still some cement sticking out a little bit. And then just hit OK. And once we're happy again, we can save that, File, Save As, pavement bump as well. Next, I'm going to apply the bump maps we created in Maya in order to give our geometry some surface detail. I'm going to start off by applying the bump map to our wall. So I'm going to select that and go to the attribute editor. If we select the brick wall material from the far right hand side here, we can apply the bump map to the bump mapping attribute here. If we click on the flag and then select a file node from the create render node window, this automatically creates a network including a bump 2D node and a file node mapped to the bump value here, which we can get to by clicking on the arrow. This is where we need to load in our bump map. I'm going to turn off the filter type again because I know my image is fairly high resolution. And then just select brick wall bump. This has automatically set up our bump network, and if we save this image and let's maximize that and hit render, we can see the effect of our bump map. Unfortunately, however, our bump map doesn't line up with our bricks, and this is because we changed the U value on our brick wall color in order to repeat the texture twice here. So we need to do the same on our bump file place 2D texture node here. So we can select that in the attribute editor from this tab and change the repeat U to 2. And if we save the image, we can hit render again. So if I hit 1 to 1, we can see that the bricks are now shaded by our bump map here, but the bump depth is a little bit too strong. So again, in the attribute editor, we need to change the bump depth down to something that's a bit more reasonable, perhaps 0.2 or 0.1, and this would all be dependent on the contrast of our image. So perhaps something like that would be pretty good. We can just start to see our bricks being picked out by our bump map here. This would be particularly effective when the camera's moving as well, and in fact if we turn on high quality rendering inside our viewport here, we can start to see the effect of the bump map. As we rotate the camera, the bricks are shaded with black and white in order to give them the illusion of surface detail. So I'm going to do the same on our floor as well. I'm going to go to the attribute editor, select our pavement material, scroll down to bump mapping and click on the flag, and then select the file from the pop-up window, and again navigate via our bump value to our 2D file node. While we're at it, we can change the repeat U value of our place 2D texture node here to 2, and then from the file node navigate to the bump map of our pavement, so pavement bump, and hit open and hit render again. We can again see that our bump information is slightly too harsh there. So we can change down our bump depth to something a bit more reasonable, again dependent on the contrast of our image. And this gives us surface detail on our textures and our geometry, which is particularly effective when the camera moves, as the bump map is actually changing the direction of the normals at any given point on the surface here, and therefore how it reacts to light. So we'll get little highlights or little changes in brightness or apparent brightness as the camera moves. Next we're going to look at how we can put some graffiti on our wall, and to do this we're going to need to extract it from a photo and create an alpha channel for it. So I'm going to start off by opening up my source image, file open, and I'm going to select graffiti. If we go view fit on screen, you can see that this consists of some graffiti on some kind of steel wall here, with some buildings in the background and a car park in the foreground. Now in order to put this onto something in Maya, we need to be able to extract it from this photo here, and also create some kind of alpha channel for it, or another kind of image that will tell Maya what's supposed to be transparent and what's supposed to be graffiti. So if we were to put it over the top of something, we could see what was meant to be underneath, in our case the wall. The best way to extract this and also create an alpha channel is to use the extract function. This can be found under filter, extract, and this brings us into another pop-up window with a number of different options. In extract, we need to highlight what the edge is of what we want extracted, and we can have some tolerance either side of the edge here, and Photoshop will try and decide exactly where we want that edge to be. Creating really nice edges for mattes is something that takes quite a lot of time and is quite tedious, and the extract tool will hopefully speed that up for us. What we need to do is make sure we've got the highlighter selected, and then we need to mark the edges that we want to keep. So I'm going to zoom in with Control+. This will make our life a bit easier. And I'm also going to turn on Smart Highlighting. This gives us a little crosshairs here, and we'll try and guess where the edge is and adjust the crosshairs in order to keep us on track. So you can see it was slightly lost there on the yellow paint, but all in all, it's not doing too bad a job. I'm going to make sure that I stick to the black edge here. I started off on the lilac, but I think it's going to be easier to extract it along the black edge here. That's because there's more contrast in between the black and the lilac than there is between the lilac and anything else. And as soon as I get to a point where I need to move my image, I'm just going to stop highlighting, hold down space, move the image with the mouse, and then continue highlighting all the way around the graffiti here. This is probably going to take some time, but it's not actually that hard with smart highlighting, as even if we do go off the edge a little bit, Photoshop adjusts for us. So I'm going to actually speed up this section here, just so you don't have to see me highlight all of it. We might have a few more issues on the floor here because we've got some shadow which will confuse it next to the black. But we just might have to be careful to try and keep our edge a little more consistent than in other places, but it should be okay. And then once we've got all the way around, what we need to do now is just mark the interior sections that we want to get rid of as well. So all this lilac stuff here, we're just going to keep the white and the black. So let's start off with this bit around here, just the same as before, highlighting the edge here and here as well. And what we'll get is some nice brickwork showing through these holes here. And then when I've highlighted all the sections, we need to fill the sections that we want to retain. We need to do that with this paint bucket tool here. I'm going to select the interior, and you can see it turns blue there. Then we can hit preview in order to see our extracted graffiti previewed. So that hasn't done too bad a job. We can see that the bright green sections here are the sections that are going to be deleted. We just need to go around and just clean up some of our edges a little bit here. And we can do that with this tool. Makes the mask transparent. We can actually zoom in with Control+ and just go around and paint out any sections we don't really need. You can see here at the beginning where I began tracing the lilac section. We just need to remove that. And we can actually change the strength of our brush here as well, or the opacity of it, using the keyboard letters 1 to 5, 1 being the softest and 5 being the hardest. And this is where you really want to spend a bit of time quite up close just getting your borders correct, because we're going to use the actual pixels here to create an alpha for this image as well. And if we don't want to see any little bits like that sticking out, although we do in this case because that's actually part of the graffiti, we need to make sure that we remove them at this stage, otherwise we'll get these little fuzzy bits. And if we hold down Alt, we can actually do the reverse, so we can paint back in our graffiti here if we're missing a bit, or if we accidentally rub it out, we can hold down Alt and paint it back in again. What I'm going to actually do at the bottom here is just cut off the bottom. I'm going to say that my wall comes up about this far, so I'm not going to worry too much about getting these edges along the bottom here correct. I'm just going to concentrate on the ones that are higher up than this. And when we've gone around the entire image, just correcting the edges, we can hit OK. And there you can see we've extracted our graffiti there. Next, we're going to clean up our graffiti, resize it, reposition it, and create an alpha channel for it. So I'm going to start off by resizing my image and also repositioning where the graffiti lies in my image, and to do that I'm going to use the crop tool. Just going to clear the settings. What I'm going to do is make sure that I crop the size to a 2:1 aspect ratio, so we're going to match the polygonal planes that we made in Maya, so therefore when we apply it to the wall we know exactly where it's going to lie. I'm going to make sure it's a 1024 width by a 512 height. This will constrain my crop measurements to a rectangle, which is 2:1. And I'm also going to move it up slightly, so we just chop off the bottom of our graffiti in order to make it look like it's lying level with the floor there. Perhaps just a tiny bit bigger. And then when I'm happy, just hit return. So if I go view actual pixels, we can see that we've still got quite a large texture there, plenty of resolution. But we do need to move some of these, or remove some of these inconsistencies here, and this is because it was actually painted on some metal sheeting, perhaps on a bridge of some kind. And in order to make it look like it's going to be on a brick wall, we're going to have to remove those little dots. I'm going to do this with the clone stamp this time. Sometimes when using the healing brush tool, if we heal an area, we can see after it tries to heal it, it blends it with the wrong section, like here, which can be quite frustrating. So I'm going to dispense with the healing and just use the straight clone stamp tool. And just like before, I'm going to hold down Alt to sample an area, click on the image, and then just paint it across any lines or dots, in this case this one here, the edge of the metal sheeting. And I'm just going to go along my image, just removing the majority of these. It's okay to have a few, they could be considered dirt, but if it looks like it's the edge of some metal sheeting, I'm going to remove it. So I'm happy with that now. That's my nicely cleaned up texture. What we need to do now is prepare an embedded alpha channel for this, so that when we apply it in Maya, it'll automatically be displayed correctly on top of whatever we apply it to. We can do this quite easily. We can create a layer inside our channels here. So we've got our RGB. We're also going to create an A channel or alpha channel by creating a new layer here, just by clicking on this little button. Then all we need to do in terms of black and white is designate what we want to be opaque and what we want to be transparent. The best way to do that is just click on RGB again and turn off alpha, is to use the pixels that we've already cut out here. Rather than trace them with any kind of magic wand tool or lasso tool, what we can do is just right click on the layer and go select pixels. This has automatically selected any pixels here, which is our graffiti. And then inside our channels here, we can highlight our alpha channel and we can fill this in. Edit fill. And I'm going to choose white. And then hit OK. Control D just to unselect everything. And this is now the alpha channel, which is going to designate white opacity and black transparency. And so when I'm happy, I can just go back to my RGB again and go File, Save As. And we're going to save this again in our source images as graffiti with alpha. And just hit Save. Next, we're going to apply the graffiti to our wall in Maya, and we're going to do this by creating a new material and then combining both materials together in a layered shader. I'm going to start off by assigning a new material to our wall here. We're going to come back to our brick material a little later, but for now I'm going to go right click, assign new material, Lambert. I'm going to call this graffiti material. Hit return. And I'm going to map the graffiti texture we created to the color attribute by clicking on the flag and selecting 2D file node from our create render node window. And I'm going to navigate to the graffiti in our source images, graffiti with alpha, and hit open. What we can immediately see is the graffiti on our wall here, and also the transparency is taking effect as well. If we have a look in the common material attributes of the graffiti material, we can see that the color now has a connection. This is the graffiti, and the transparency now has a connection as well. This goes to the graffiti as well, but this is actually controlled by the embedded alpha channel. And this is actually driving the transparency of our material here. So if we look at the file, alpha is no longer luminance or the brightness of the pixels, it's actually this embedded alpha channel we created. If we save this image and hit render and hit 1:1, we can see our graffiti there. And if we want to just change the quality a little bit, we can turn off the filter type again inside the attribute editor, the graffiti material. We can go to the color and the file texture here and turn filter type to off. And we should see a slight sharpening of our texture here. So we've got a material with our graffiti on, we've got a material with our wall on. How do we combine them together? Well, we can use a layered shader if we want to, and I'm going to do that in the hypershade. Panels, hypershade. We can see we've got our brick material here and our graffiti material, and we're going to combine them together in a layered shader, which we can get from our create Maya node window here. Just select layered shader. Just going to maximize that with space. And if we double click on the layered shader, we can see its attributes here in the attribute editor. What I'm going to do is drag both of our materials, both the brick wall and the graffiti material, into this box here, which is where the two materials are layered up together. So first of all, brick wall material, middle mouse button into here, and secondly the graffiti material, middle mouse button into here. We can then delete this green one here, which is the default one, which we no longer need, and then we can rearrange these two to put the graffiti material in front of the wall material. So I'm going to go middle mouse button and just drag it in front there. And then we can automatically see from our preview swatch here that the graffiti is now on top of the brick wall. And if we have a look at this network by going right click, graph network, and looking in our work area, we can see we have a layered shader, and into the layered shader goes our graffiti Lambert along with its color and transparency, which are controlled. And then we also have our brick wall material, which also has its color and transparency going into our layered shader here. So all that remains for us to do is to select our wall material here, or our wall geometry, sorry, and assign our layered shader to it. Right click, assign material to selection. We can see that the layered shader isn't previewed in our perspective view here, our camera view. We're going to have to look at it in the render view instead to see if it's worked. So we're going to go panels, render view, and then hit render. So if I maximize our render view and hit 1:1, we can see that we now have our brick wall with our graffiti on top of it. In this section, we're going to try and bed the graffiti into the wall, make it look a little bit more like it belongs there by applying the same bump we have on the wall to the graffiti, and also fading it out a little bit in order to see some of the wall showing through beneath it. If we have a look in our render here, we can see that although our graffiti is on top of our wall here, we've only got the color information correct here. The actual surface detail and texture is wrong. We don't see any variation that the bricks should cause from underneath. So what we can do is we can apply the same bump information that's in this material here to this material in order to give it some bump. So if we go into the hypershade on the left hand side, panels, hypershade, we can see we've still got our layered shader in the work area here. In fact, while we're here, let's name that. Just going to call it wall graffiti, both together. We can see that we've got a bump node here going into our brick wall material, and also a file driving that bump node, but no bump information going into this one. So what we can do is middle mouse drag the bump 2D node onto our graffiti material and release the mouse and just select default. The default connection in this case, in this context, is a bump connection. Then if we save the image and hit render again, we can see that not only do we have the color, we now also have the bump on our wall as well. And this is perhaps also telling us that the bump should just be turned down a tiny bit, especially here. And we can do that by double clicking on the bump node in the hypershade and perhaps just putting it down to about 0.15. And then we can see just a hint less of bump there. What we'd also like to do is perhaps just fade out the paint here as well. It's very jet black here and pure silver. We don't see any of the wall coming through behind it. And we can do that in Photoshop. The transparency of our texture here, and hence our material, is controlled by the embedded alpha channel, which is here. And if white is totally opaque and black is totally transparent, then in order to make our graffiti a little bit semi-transparent, we can adjust it to make the white a little bit grey. We could do this in the levels, image adjustment levels. Perhaps just pull this slider down till we've got a bit of grey in there and hit OK. We could also, if we had time, perhaps vary the transparency so it's more faded in some areas than other. When we're happy, we can save our image just with Ctrl S. And rather than saving as a new name, if we do Ctrl S, then when we go back to Maya, we can just select our texture in the hypershade, this one here, double click on it and hit reload. And it should update based on our change. And then if we save this image and hit render again, we can see that our texture is now a little bit faded. And we can reduce the transparency as much as we want till we get the desired result. If we have a look at our wall here, we can see that there's no kind of specular highlights on it. It's completely diffuse material. The only reflection of light we get is an even reflection, causing an even level of brightness across here. But if we had a blend, say, then we could change the specularity of our walls in different places. Next, we're going to make the wall shiny by assigning a blend material to it, but controlling the areas of shininess, limiting it to the silver paint by using a specular map. So far, we've been using Lambert materials. These are materials that just have diffuse reflectance of light. Light hits the material and scatters evenly in all directions, giving uniform brightness. What we're going to do is change the graffiti material to a blend, just double clicking on it in the hypershade and then changing the type from Lambert to blend. Unfortunately, this means we have to rename it again, but shouldn't take too much time. Graffiti material. We can immediately see that along with our common material attributes, we now also have some specular shading, some specular highlights. So depending on the angle of the light source and the camera, we'll get little white highlights on certain surfaces. So if we save this image and hit render, we can see that some parts of the wall, in conjunction with the bump map and the light, now have or appear to have slight highlights. But we don't necessarily want this to occur on the bricks, we want them to remain dull, but we do want it to occur on the silver area here. So in order to make this happen, we're going to have to use another texture and map it to our specular colour. If we have a look at the blend material in the attribute editor, we can see that when the specular colour is set to black, we have no specular shading or no highlights. When it's set to white, we have very bright specular highlights on certain sections. So what we're going to do is go into Photoshop and make a matte that we can use. And we're going to base this on this image here that we've already created. To begin with, I'm going to delete the alpha channel here and then just go back to our layers to show our color layer. And what I'm going to do is select it, right click, select pixels, making sure I'm on the selection options there, and making sure I do it over the picture as well and not the type. And I'm actually going to fill it in white, so edit, fill, make sure we fill white and hit OK. So I've got the section that I want to be specular. Now I need to designate the section I want to be non-specular, so I'm going to create another layer, clicking on this button here, drag it underneath my existing layer, and then fill this with a black colour. And this is going to be the matte that I'm going to use to control specularity. And I'm going to save this. In fact, first I'll flatten the image under Layer, Flatten Image, and then save it as Brick Wall Specular. And hit save. And OK again. Then I'm going to go back into Maya. I'm going to double click on my graffiti material, the Blinn, and I'm going to map a texture to our specular colour here by clicking on the flag. Create a 2D file node. Might as well turn the filter type to off, and image name, I'm going to select Brick Wall Specular. If we just hit save and render again, we can now see that our silver paint is now highly specular and shiny, especially on the grouts here, where at certain angles down to our bump map, the normals are pointing in just the right way to get specular highlights. And the wall itself is nice and dull. And because we've got a black and white matte here, we've got the extremes, pure white and pure black, we can actually go halfway in between the two without needing to go back into Photoshop by adjusting the colour balance of this texture here. Underneath the colour balance section here, we can either do colour offset or colour gain, depending on whether we want to make the white darker or the black lighter. So perhaps if I didn't want it to be quite so shiny, I could turn my colour gain down to about 3/4. And we get slightly less of a specular effect on our silver paint here. Lastly, we're just going to look at layered textures to see how we can combine textures together rather than materials in Maya in order to just put some dirt or darkening down towards the crevice where the wall meets the pavement. So I'm going to start off by going back to my hypershade, and I'm just going to graph the network of the brick wall material by going right click, graph network. We can see if I maximize that and also the work area, that the shader network for the brick wall material consists of the brick wall material, the color information from this file, the bump information from this file. But we can actually combine files together with the layered texture a little bit like we combine materials together with the layered shader. The layered texture can be found under other textures in the create Maya node bar here. If we click on it, we get one of those. If we double click on it in the attribute editor, we can see it looks a little bit like the layered shader in that we can drag and drop textures into this bar here in order to layer them up. The good thing about the layered texture is that we can also change the blend mode here, and we're going to do this to try and multiply some dirt on top of our wall here to make it look a little bit less uniform. So you can use any kind of texture you want for this, maybe make your own bespoke dirt texture. In this case, I'm just going to use a ramp for now. And if we double click on our layer texture again, we can drag and drop both our textures into this layered up area here by using the middle mouse button and dropping them in there. And you can see that this automatically creates the connections of the color, the out color from both textures going into the in color or the inputs of this layered texture here, so we can delete the default. This leaves us with what looks like a ramp. This is because the ramp is on top of our file texture and the blend mode is over. I'm going to change the colors of my ramp. We can get to it by clicking on the arrow here, and I'm going to delete the green one in the middle and change the red to a very dark grey and the blue to a white. Once I've done that in the layered texture, I'm going to get back to that by double clicking on it. If I change the blend mode to multiply this time, we can see that the ramp is now multiplied over the top of our wall, giving us black at the bottom and normal wall color at the top here. So all that remains for us to do is to reconnect up the layered texture into our material to override its existing color information. So I can go middle mouse button, drop that onto my material here and go default. And then if I save this image and hit render again, we can see that my wall material is now shaded from light to dark, the top here. And with a bit of tweaking on our ramp, the gradient, perhaps turn it from a linear to an exponential down, and perhaps put in a couple more points here just to make slightly different gradient here. We can get the effect of a darkening where the wall meets the pavement. A little bit like so. And this would work particularly well if we did a similar thing to the pavement as well. So I'm going to go back to my library here. I'm going to select both my brick wall material and also my pavement material with Shift, and then just go graph input connection. So we've got both of those in our work area. And what I'm going to do is duplicate this section of the network here to give me my layered texture again, and also the ramp texture. So with all three selected, I'm going to go edit, duplicate shading network. This gives me another layered texture over here, and also another file texture which we don't need. This is a duplicate of the wall. I'm going to hit delete for that, and also the place 2D texture node, leaving me my new layered texture, a duplicate ramp, and we can then connect these up into our pavement in order to add some blackness here as well. So I need to put my pavement texture into my layered texture, so I'm going to go middle mouse button, drop that in there as default, and then double clicking on my layered texture here, I can delete anything I don't need, including this black one here. And there we can see I now have my ramp over the top of my pavement texture multiplied in order to add this dirt at the bottom here. If we hit render, we can see that the dirt is in the wrong place. It's down here at the bottom. And what we actually need to do is connect this up to the material, so we'll go default and hit save. And there we can see we've actually added it in the correct place. We've got a darkening down there. It's almost like a bit of occlusion or shadow there. And we can adjust that if we want to by adjusting this ramp here to get more of a gradient along our pavement. And so if I just go to my render view, and hit render, we can see our final textured up pavement and wall here. We've used layered shaders to combine materials, putting the graffiti on our wall. We've also combined bump information on two different materials. We've used a specular map to control the shininess of the graffiti. And we've also looked at how we can use a layered texture to combine two textures together, which is another way of combining things rather than the layered shader.